All right, so representing the business and the software industry, I'm relatively low-tech, so I have no presentation, and you'll have to bear with me addressing you for a few minutes. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to address this distinguished audience and on this great panel. I really want to give the perspective of the software industry and how, how we see, not the challenges of big data in a GDPR or Convention 108 environment, but more the opportunities that exist for big data and data analytics to thrive. First of all, a quick word of introduction. BSA, so we are a global trade association. We are present in 19 countries around the world. We represent multinational companies who are at the forefront of data innovation. So we're called software because they used to be called software companies, but companies like Microsoft, like IBM, like Oracle, like SaaS, like Salesforce, like many others, who used to be traditionally software are now in the sort of data analytics space. Now, before I start, I want to also ask the question: what is big data? We talk about big data. Well, Wojciech's slide had, big data equals big responsibility. It's true. Big data is a buzzword that sounds ominous. Data is about what? What is data? Data is information. It's nothing more, nothing less. And the situation we're facing ourselves today, which is different from we were in 1970, is we have a conflation of three different factors. We have an abundance of data. So all questions that data is the new oil is wrong, because oil is important because it's rare. Data is abundant. We're creating data at the speed of light. We have enormous capacity to store the data. And we also have great computing power to do things with that data. Data at rest, data on its own means nothing and doesn't lead anywhere. It's what you can actually do with the data that makes things great, bigger, and better. Now, when we look at the business environment and when we talk about data and the data economy, there are two types, roughly, of business models that companies use. You have companies who develop tools, technologies, analytics that they monetize to their customers. And their customers can be SMEs, can be governments, can be larger companies, and they are processing the data for their customers in ways that the customers instruct them to. And then you have the other camp of companies who are companies who develop technologies that use data. They are putting them on the market for free, and they are making money. How? By processing the data for their purposes using advertisement or other means to actually monetize their innovation. Now, there's no bad or wrong or better business model. The companies that we represent are really on the first camp. The companies who develop solutions, technology that helps others, they monetize the technology, and the data is just part of the service of the offering that they undertake. And the data is big data. Let's call it for that. In my organization, we abhor that term. We don't call it like this because indeed it has this very negative connotation. So we just talk about data innovation. That's a lot simpler. But it's what? It's just a analytics that is applied to data sets in all kinds of different fields of society and the economy. It's used in banking, it's used in cybersecurity, it's used in advertising, as I mentioned a second ago. It's used everywhere. And actually, the European Commission recognizes, and it's in its DSM, Digital Single Market Strategy, recognized that big data, that's the term used by the Commission, is central to the EU's competitiveness. And it's a catalyst for economic growth, innovation, and digitization across all economic sectors and for society as a whole in Europe. So, just back to my point, what I want to talk to you about is the opportunities and the great things that data has in store for us. At the same time, this innovation, this data innovation happens not just here in Europe. It happens on a global basis, and we have to. The companies that I represent, that I work for, do actually conduct and offer their solutions, their innovation around the world. But Europe is particularly important because it's a very large market. Second, it has very detailed rules on privacy and data protection that actually have an impact on the data innovation, on the way that data can be processed, stored, used, destroyed, etc., etc. And to simplify, for from our perspective, there are three main criteria that are key for data innovation. The first one is the ability to process data in an automated way using analytics that the GDPR refers to as profiling. The ability to repurpose data. You collect data for one purpose, but then you realize 5, 6, 7 years later that actually you could do greater things with that, and being able to have access to the data to repurpose it is critical. And the third one, which will be addressed in the next panel, is the ability to transfer data. Data innovation doesn't happen just here, doesn't happen just in the United States, doesn't just happen in Japan, happens all around the place, and data needs to be able to flow freely across borders. Looking specifically at GDPR, Europe, and first of all, personal data. What is personal data? Our definition, our acception of what is personal data is extremely broad. And it's broad in the legislation. It's been broadened even by the courts, the CJU, meaning that application of rules in a wide range of contexts that will impact big data and data innovation. For instance, there's one simple thing that everyone who lives in Brussels, who's been in Brussels, traffic. Traffic's horrendous here. There's a number of solutions that allow, through the use of collection of data, to map paths that are faster, that allow you to avoid traffic, spend more time either in the office or with loved ones, or not be late like I was today to join this conference. But all this will be personal data with all the rules that are devised in the data protection regulations that we'll have to apply in terms of consent, in terms of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But back to the three criteria that are critical in this space. The ability to process data and to process it in an automated way. In the data protection context, there's not a million ways to be able to process the data. A few of them, is consent. Consent, which I know is not the gold standard and shouldn't be regarded as the linchpin of all type of processing, but de facto has become that, has been tightened. To have a consent that is freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous at any given time in the context of a data processing for a variety of purposes is complicated. We're talking about data innovation. We're talking not about processing your data or my data. We're talking about processing the data of tens of thousands, tens of millions, about billions of data sets. So requesting a consent that is freely and ambiguous, specific, informed is extremely complicated. You'll tell me, well, there's a bunch of things like the legitimate interest that can be used in that context in order to be able to achieve the things that you want to do. Legitimate interest still is unclear and needs to be weighed against the data subject's interest. Of course, that is absolutely important. But organizations may have several legitimate interests that may be relevant. It could be for prevention of fraud. It could be for the misuse of services, could be for the physical integrity of the IT services or the cybersecurity of the system. But the processing must be necessary for the legitimate interest. And again, let's try to prove this necessity at any given moment while doing data analytics. You say, well, it's fine, you're licensing data analytics solutions, so contracts should actually be a valid form of a valid legal ground. But some regulators and even and some of the more tech-friendly innovators in Europe consider that contracts are unlikely to be a valid basis for processing of personal data for data analytics because it's difficult to show that the level of processing for analytics by its nature is necessary for the performance of the contract. So that's just requesting the authorization to process the data. You move now to the profiling restrictions, which is contained in the GDPR. And profiling is just analytics. It's just another word for it. It's just another synonym. It's just the ability to put an algorithm to a volume of data sets to extract something that is important. It's used in marketing. It's used in many different fields. But it's all about harnessing the data, making the data available. It's one of the latest, it was one of the latest Article 22 negotiated in the context of the GDPR a year and a half ago, it's still something that creates that has a lot of questions. The Article 29 is still is working to issue some guidance on the matter, and they they held in April this year a Fab Lab where I was fortunate to be invited with a number of colleagues where we were discussing and trying to feed in the process of this guidance that will come out of that will come out of Article 29, because this is something that will determine the ability for data innovation to move forward. Second element, so on top of the ability to use the data and to conduct analytics on them, you have the ability to repurpose the data. And GDPR also contains some purpose limitation for the data. This is something that is, it's not a problem, but it's something that causes concerns and causes questions. How can we? So we have all these data sets at our disposal, and in 2 years, 3 years, we find other uses that can be used for that. How can we be able to actually process that data in order for us to make groundbreaking findings? I mean, just one example of how data analytics work and how data innovation is critical. For many years, doctors are baffled by the infant death syndrome, which happens where kids are born and unfortunately after a few days and weeks, something happened and they die. They couldn't figure out what the factors were, how to solve that. And one day, some medical researchers sifted through millions and millions and millions of medical records of kids who had been affected with that syndrome. And they actually were able to highlight and to pinpoint and to find out what are not necessarily the reasons and the cause, but actually what are the symptoms and what symptoms can we treat in order to avoid this thing. This is just one of the ways that analytics will help us in our daily lives for years to come. The third key element to data innovation, and which is actually maybe the most important one, is the data transfers aspect. Without data transfers, we will not be able to process all the data that we have at our disposal. Just let me give you a quick, it's always good to be reminded of that, the volume of data that exists. So from the moment where the first information was recorded, 3,000 years ago, till today, so that's roughly about 5,000 years, 90% of the data that exists today was created in the last 2 years. That's it. Data doubles, the volume of data that we have around the world doubles every year and 3 months. And this is a trend, that will not stop. The data, can we store the data here all the time? Probably not. The data needs to be able to flow across borders. There are a few mechanisms available under the data protection regulation, or 9546, and then in the data protection regulation. The gold standard, of course, is adequacy. Adequacy is a great mechanism, but when you have 9 countries and 3 regions around the world that are adequate, that is somehow a limitation. The other mechanisms that are contract-based are under threats. There's a couple of cases pending. One of the General Court of the EU, one in Ireland that will probably be going to the CJEU at some point. And if these contract-based mechanisms for transfers of data are taken down, that will leave us in a situation where there will not be a lot of data transfers available outside of these 9 countries and 3 regions around the world. Data and data innovation is critical for the growth of our society, of our continent. The rules that we enacted 18 months ago, that will be implemented about a year from now, will always take time to be enacted. Technology doesn't wait. Technology will always continue. The approach taken by the Council of Europe Ordinary Convention on the principle-based is an approach that actually does work in the context of flexibility. So protection on the one hand and strong principles, but at the same time allowing innovation to flourish. You may all remember the alarmed comments of Chancellor Merkel back in November of last year, when she realized that the Industry 4.0, that she has banked the entire growth of Germany for the years to come, the digitalization of German industry, may be at risk due to the data minimization principles that we had introduced in our different data protection legislations. So keeping in mind of the developments and keeping in mind of how can we ensure that we have a balanced and flexible approach moving forward will be critical. Now, just maybe the last point that I want to raise before I run out of time is that I agree that the fact that data innovation, analytics, artificial intelligence all raise some serious questions, some serious ethical questions about, algorithms. How can we trust an algorithm? There's a lot of calls for algorithm transparency, for responsibility. These are all valid questions that need to be addressed. At the same time, I want to remind you that I work for the technology industry, but I'm incapable of reading an algorithm. When we're talking about disclosing algorithm source codes and the transparency of the algorithms in itself, who will be able to actually assess whether they do not have a bias, they do not lead to discriminations? We have to find other ways to be able to address these important issues in this context. Thank you.